Hello and welcome to Central Online. We have got a special spring edition for you today. The sun is out, spring has finally sprung, so I hope you're enjoying the sun wherever you are today. We've got some fresh worship for you, Coxie and Ashley. They're going to be doing one of their own songs for us today, and that's going to be absolutely fantastic. And Mark is going to be sharing us his word, which he's prepared for the in-person service, but you guys get to see that today as well. So I hope you enjoy the service, and I'll be back at the end with all what's going on at church now the Easter holidays is over.
And oh, the mystery, you crossed the great divide to show your love for me. As you hung upon the cross, you spilled your blood for me. And now I see my sin that held you there, it has no hold on me. For you rose again, and now you have the victory. And forever I will sing, thank you, thank you, thank you for the cross and how I love you. Jesus, you have won my heart. This is love, and this is love. And it's all of me, I give my life to you. Receive this offering. It's all I have, but you deserve my everything. And forever I will sing, thank you, thank you, thank you for the cross and how I love you. Jesus, you have won my heart, and this is love. And this is love. Majesty, majesty, you laid your glory down for me. Majesty, majesty, you laid your glory down for me. Majesty, majesty, amazing love, how can it be? Majesty, majesty, and forever I will sing, thank you, thank you, thank you for the cross and how I love you. Jesus, you have won my heart. This is love. And we sing thank you, thank you, thank you for the cross and how I love you. Jesus, you have won my heart. This is love. And this is love.
Welcome to Church Online. Usually I'm presenting, but I'm preaching in person for this week, so this week I'm also preaching for online. If you've ever been to our in-person services towards the start of the year or maybe February time, then you would have been there when we were doing a series on Proverbs 3 in trust. And I was meant to be preaching the start of this month, but I got delayed because it was Palm Sunday, so we needed to have a Palm Sunday themed preach. I was delayed and put back to the 24th this Sunday. And so what I'm about to preach on is on Proverbs 3, so it might be a bit out of date in terms of series, but I'm sure the content is still relevant to some of you guys that are watching this. So, speaking of Proverbs 3, obviously, and we're just going to be going to Proverbs 3, 11 and 12, and then after that we're going to head to Hebrews 12 and 7. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. As a father, the son he delights in. And then Hebrews 12, verses 4 to 11. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and have you completely forgotten his word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So this verse, it speaks of God's correction in his discipline over us. And if you think of any healthy type of parenting, then there is correction and discipline involved. And a father isn't cruel because he disciplines his son. When I was 6 years old and my dad gave me in trouble for standing too close to a fire, he wasn't cruel for doing that. No, he would have been cruel if he let me stay too close to the fire. But I have got 3 older siblings. I've got an older sister and 2 older brothers. And because I'm the youngest of the family, I have been labeled something called the golden child. And this means that apparently it means I get off of more things, that I'm a bit more spoiled than the rest, and just generally more loved than them. And there was another golden child in the Bible, and his name was Joseph. And he was such a golden child that his brothers actually wanted to kill him. They plotted to kill him, and instead they ended up selling him to slavery in Egypt. But God wanted to use Joseph as an influential figure in Egypt, but he couldn't really use him in the current state that he was in as a young man. He was spoiled, he was a bit prideful, like I'm told some golden children are. But God couldn't use him in that state. So God set a series of circumstances in his way. And he suffered, he endured at the hand of his brothers, at the hand of slavery and prison time and years in just suffering. And at the end of that, he came out on top, and he was second only to the Pharaoh in all of Egypt. Now this same spoiled golden child earlier in Genesis, at the end of Genesis, is looking before his brothers, the brothers who were responsible for 13 years of slavery and prison time. He looks at them and he says, you intended this for evil, but God meant it for good. Could the Joseph who stood before his brothers and boasted of his dreams, of his calling, and said how much better he was than his brothers, could that Joseph had stood before the same brothers and said that ultimately their betrayal was a good service to him? No, it was the suffering and the inconveniences of life, the God's correction and discipline, that turned Joseph from a spoiled brat to an influential leader in Egypt. Another person that God uses later on in the book of Exodus is Moses. Moses grew up in the palaces in Egypt. He grew up in royalty, and then he was banished. He was outcasted. He was exiled from his land. And then God used him to bring the ancient Israelites out of Egypt. his hurt later on was able to provide breakthrough for other people because he endured his suffering as discipline. In fact, the Greek word discipline that is used in Hebrews, is used 9 times in Hebrews, is the Greek word that Stephen in Acts uses to describe Moses being educated in Egypt. God's correction in our life, the product isn't destruction or condemnation, but as it says in Hebrews, it's a harvest of righteousness and peace. When we experience God's discipline, we're not in the courtroom, we're in the home, and God is a father, not a judge. So that's what we're going to be looking at for the next 5-10 minutes. We're going to be looking at discipline and the various forms that takes throughout the Bible. So I've titled this The Donkey, the Whale, and the Worm. So the first one is the donkey. In Numbers we read about the Moabites, and they reach out to this prophet called Balaam, and they ask Balaam to curse their opponents, Israel, who is God's chosen people. But God doesn't want Balaam to do that, so he asks and inquires of God, and there's a little bit of back and forth, and then eventually Balaam goes and he travels with the Moabites to their camp. And we're going to read of what happens in Numbers 22, verses 21 to 39. Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. But God was very angry with him. God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, it turned off the road into a field. Balaam beat it to get it back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path through the vineyards, with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat the donkey again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam, and he was angry and beat it with his staff. When the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, "You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" "No," he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. The angel of the Lord asked him, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one. Before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from these 3 times. If it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it." Balaam's prophetic insight was blinded by the idea of a reward. 3 times later in the New Testament, it speaks of Balaam, and it doesn't speak of him in a positive manner. Jude 1 tells us that his path was a wicked one. Peter speaks about him as well, and so does Revelation, and they speak of him all as a warning about walking a dangerous and wicked path. And this is what Balaam was doing. He was walking this dangerous and wicked path with the Moabites. But God in his grace looked at Balaam traveling this wicked and dangerous path, and he sent a disruption. And this disruption came in the form of a donkey. Maybe God's blessing and his mercy in your life doesn't look like him blessing your path, but rather rebuking and disrupting it. Balaam didn't see the donkey as a blessing to begin with. In fact, he beat it. He despised it, like it says in Proverbs, "Do not despise the Lord's rebuke." He despised this donkey. He said if he had a sword in hand, he would kill it, which is ironic because there was an angel before him with a sword in hand that was ready to kill him. Ultimately, this donkey was the greatest service to Balaam at that moment, but he couldn't see it. Just like Balaam, God's protection and his mercy in your life may come in the form of your plans being disrupted via a donkey. Ultimately, this lowly and meek animal possessed more discernment than the prophet. The donkey could see clearly the angel of the Lord before him, but God's supposed prophet could it? Which is ironic because later on, Balaam says, I am the one whose eyes see clearly. No matter how spiritually tuned you are, there may be donkeys in your life that ultimately can discern and see better than you can. When we walk the path that we ourselves have set before us and we encounter disruption and inconvenience, maybe that's God's protection over our lives. Maybe the donkey that bruises our leg was put there by God. If you read the King James, then you know that the donkey is called the ass. And in our modern world, the ass may take a different meaning. And to be honest, God's correction in your life may come in the form of an ass. So don't despise the asses, the donkeys in your life, because it could be God's correction and His discipline over you. It could be His grace in a form that you're not familiar with. So don't forsake these things. Endure your donkeys as discipline. The next form that God's correction can take in your life is the whale. Now, we're reading from the book of Jonah, and I know that it isn't a whale that swallows him, it's just a big fish, but I'm using whale for the sake of alliteration and memorability. So if you're not familiar with the book of Jonah, Jonah is called by God to go to the city of Nineveh and preach to them and tell them that judgment and condemnation is coming, and asking them to repent and turn from their evil ways. And so Jonah, like any responsible prophet in his time, he got up and he ran in the opposite direction. He got in a boat and he tried to get to the southern beaches of Spain, but there was a disruption, just like there was with Balaam. And the Bible says that Jonah encountered a great storm while he was on the boat. And it's funny because the word used for great there is also the word used to describe the city of Nineveh, the great city of Nineveh. It's the Hebrew word Gedolah. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. It's the Hebrew word Gedolah. So if Jonah wasn't going to encounter the great city of Nineveh, then he's going to encounter a great storm. And so in this great storm and in the chaos is ensuing all around, the experienced sailors are trying to weather the storm. They're praying to their own individual pagan gods. They're throwing cargo into sea. They're casting lots. They're using all their strength to row back to sea. But nothing was working. But Jonah recognized that the storm was sent from God as a result of his disobedience. And so he tells the pagan sailors to throw him off the side of the boat. And they do that. They do it reluctantly, and ultimately the storm ceases. And then we get this next part that happens in the belly of a fish that is sent and appointed by God to swallow Jonah. Verse 17 in chapter 1. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head, to the roots of the mountains I sank down. We're going to skip to verse 7. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Up until this point, Jonah has been described as descending down. He went down to the docks at Tarshish. He went down into the depths of the boat, to the bilges of the boat. Then he went down into the deep of the sea, to the root of the mountains, down into the belly of the fish. Jonah was literally and spiritually at his rock bottom. Only then, when Jonah is at his bottom, does something amazing and beautiful begin to happen. He begins to change, repent, and transform his life. Something that's worth noting is that Jonah's situation didn't change until he did. He repented, but still while he was in the belly of the fish. And then Only after that fact was he spat out on the shores closer to Nineveh than he was on the boat. See, there are some things in your life that God can't do from the safety of a ship, but he can do in the belly of a fish. Maybe the miracle that you've been hoping and praying for and waiting on doesn't look like your situation changing, but it looks like you changing in your circumstance. See, all throughout the Bible we encounter people who have yet still followed God and yet still went through harrowing, difficult circumstances. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they followed and honored God, and they still went into the furnace. Daniel still went into the pit with lions. All of the New Testament disciples, they still endured persecution. They all died horrible deaths. See, it is a far greater grace for us that God joins us in the furnace, that he joins us in the belly than he takes us out of it. See, when God joins us in our circumstance, that's when transformation happens. God needed Jonah to go to Nineveh. So that meant one way Jonah was going to Nineveh. Like a parent struggling to get their child into the car seat, one way or the other they're going into the car seat, by the scruff of the neck or by the hand. And Jonah chose the scruff of the neck. Jonah was going to Nineveh through revelation or through tribulation. For Jonah, it was better to be in the belly of a large fish with God than to live in rebellion on the beaches of Spain. The environment or situation you currently find yourself in may be the necessary environment for your transformation. Endure your situation as discipline. And then we've got to the third point, the form that God's correction takes in our lives, and it is the worm. See, in the book of Jonah, Jonah plays two characters from a parable in the New Testament. He's like the prodigal son who ran away from his father, who went completely against the word, completely abandoned God, and then like the prodigal son, he returned and came back to his father. See, many people think that Jonah's story ends there with him being spat out on the beaches of the belly of the fish. But really, there's another 2 chapters to go, and in fact the central part of this book is found in its latter pages in chapter 3 and 4. That's when we're let in on the secret of why Jonah ran away from Nineveh. See, in the first half he's like the prodigal, but in the second half he's like the older brother who was offended that his younger brother is shown mercy. This whole time, Jonah took issue with the mission that God had given him because he had to preach repentance and mercy to this political rival of his home nation, who he had deemed unworthy and undeserving of God's grace. Just like the older brother looked at his younger brother in the parable and was offended that he was being shown grace. This is the issue that Jonah has had this whole time. He says that he knew God was going to show mercy. He knew that he was compassionate and slow to anger, and that's what he found offensive, that other people outside the nation of Israel could be let in, could be shown mercy and grace. Jonah has this idea that only the Israelites, only God's chosen people can be godly. Only they can be shown grace. But throughout this whole book, the whole book of Jonah, he's been confronted with this idea of pagans honoring God and being godly. From the storm to the city of Nineveh, in the ship you've got pagan sailors that after they throw Jonah overboard, they give offerings to God. They're compassionate. They didn't want to throw him overboard. And in fact, when Jonah was sleeping in the bilges of the boat and he was awoken by the captain said, "Arise," which is the same Hebrew word that God used to Jonah to begin with. Arise and go to Nineveh. See, Jonah ran from the words of God and woke up in the bilges of a boat with a pagan sailor who had the very words of God in his mouth. Jonah is being confronted with this idea of pagans being holy. Then he goes to Nineveh, and the whole city of Nineveh repents. He successfully preached to them, and the whole city repents. Jonah's worldview is being challenged. Ultimately, the picture of holiness in this book isn't found in God's prophet. It's found in the pagan sailors and the prodigal city. And so we're here at the end of the book. Jonah is sitting east of the city of Nineveh, sitting outside it, hoping and waiting for its destruction. Now imagine you're God in that circumstance. You're sitting on this hill east of the city that your prophet just successfully preached to, and he's sitting there pouting, waiting for you to destroy it. What do you do in that circumstance? Well, God comes again to Jonah. He doesn't come with a storm. He doesn't come with a donkey. He doesn't come with a whale. But he comes with a plant, a worm, and a question to him. God is about to teach his prophet a lesson on the very concept that he's been struggling with this whole time. His grace. God uses the plant and the worm to teach Jonah about his grace. In Jonah 4, we read about the plant that God sends and the worm in the east wind. Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said, "and I'm so angry I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend to it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and it died overnight, and the city of Nineveh, in which there are more... And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left hand, and also many livestock?" God is challenging his prophet through the plant and the worm. He is challenging his worldview, and he is expanding his view of God's grace. See, everything and every person in the book of Jonah submits to God except Jonah. You've got the sea, you've got the storm, you've got the wind, you've got the whale, you've got everything in between. And all of these things submits to God except Jonah. Or at least until he's gone through the trials of what God has laid before him. See, the authorship of Jonah is a bit disputed. Some people think it was himself that wrote it. Some people think it was someone who he told this story. But I think there's hope in that. There's hope that Jonah is telling this story because he's been transformed through the process and the trial of it. It's almost as if he's saying to these people, "Look how silly I was. Look how childish, how blind, and how foolish I was to have been shown grace from God myself, and to be so offended by other people receiving it." In his trials and the process that proved to be true, in Jonah is created a clearer, more expansive view of God's confusing and sometimes offensive grace. The withering away of our inconveniences is sometimes the greatest service that God can give us, so we should endure it as discipline. John Newman wrote a hymn about this passage here, and he calls the plant a gourd, and he speaks of the God taking away the gourds in our life as an answer to prayer. I'm just going to read this. "I ask the Lord that I might grow in faith and love and every grace, might more of his salvation know, and seek more earnestly his face. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer, but has been in such a way as almost drove me to despair. I hoped that in some favoured hour at once he'd answer my request, and by his love's constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart, and let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. Yea, more with his own hand he seemed, intent to aggravate my woe, crossed all the fair designs I schemed, blasted my gourds, and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembling cried. Wilt thou pursue thy worm to death? 'Tis in this way, the Lord replied, I answer prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ, from self and pride to set thee free, and break thy schemes of earthly joy, that thou mayst find thy all in me. The tribulations in our life can be a fruit of God's displeasure, or sometimes even our own actions, but some of the time it can be a result and fruit of God's correction and God's genuine care and overwhelming concern of us. If God were to withhold his correction from us, he would also be withholding his fatherly love from us. In Hebrews it says he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. We are legitimate sons and daughters of God because he corrects us. Jesus in Matthew 12 tells us that the one who is greater than Jonah is here. And he's speaking of himself. He says that, so Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, so I will spend 3 days in the heart of the earth. And just as Jonah sat outside the city of Nineveh, Jesus was hung and crucified on a cross outside the city of Jerusalem. Not that it would be destroyed like Jonah had hoped, but so that it would be reconciled back into God. Maybe you're watching this and you find yourself like the prodigal son who's ran from God, or maybe you're like the older brother who needs to be invited back into the party. Wherever you are at in your spiritual journey, wherever you're at with God, Jesus died for you. Our greater Jonah has come so that we could know the fullness and the real intention for our existence in our life. Jesus died for you so that you may know God.
They called him Jesus. He came to love, heal and forgive. He lived and died
Thank you, Mark, for that fantastic word. I'm sure you're really encouraged or challenged if you've been watching that here today. If you would like to know a little bit more about God and the grace that He has for us, please get in contact with us. We'd love to chat to you and help you in that. We at church this past week have started Alpha. But don't worry, if you've missed it, you can still jump in at week 2. We can even give you the first session to watch at home if you would really like to do that. But we'd love to invite you to that at 7:30 on Thursdays is Alpha. But we also have life groups as well at 7:30 down at the church, and we have Zoom life groups too if you can't get babysitters and maybe can't come out to that. Youth and kids are back on. Kids is on Fridays. And youth on Fridays as well, and youth also have Wednesdays and Sundays. Encore's on, prayer meetings back, everything is back now for this term, running up to the summer holidays. And why not jump in and get involved at church? We'd love to see you and love to have you come and be a part of what we're doing here at Central Church. Other than that, thank you for joining us here today, and we will see you next week.